All right, we've had a bit of delay here from summer travel, summertime, but we're kicking things off again here on the YouTube channel, podcast, and today we have a really special episode which I think people will love. We have Jose Pontes, who writes about 7 EV sales reports a month with Clean Technica. Many people, this is the highlight of the month. This is what we're looking forward to every month. We're waiting for Jose's latest reports, and I think especially for me, the global, the Europe and the China reports are like, I mean, I like all of them, especially like what we're doing now, where we're bringing in more countries. So you'll do it like you just did Portugal recently. Instead of just doing a handful of the same countries over and over, you're bringing in more occasional reports for other countries. But still, the Europe, the global, of course, and the China reports are like always like, oh, what's happening? These are the big markets. They're so diverse. There's so many models. The adoption rates are so high. So this is a lot of fun. So to kick things off, Jose, let's just what's your general take on the EV sales story overall? And you can talk globally and regionally. The EV sales story overall, especially compared to the narrative that's been popular for the past 6 months or so.
Hi, Zach. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, the EV sales in 2024, the story, if you read the media, is that sales are going down. But then when we look at the facts, sales are going up. Globally, I've been writing on my articles about it. It's growing in 2 digits. Okay, it's not as much as in the past where we were seeing growth of 50% year on year. But for example, in May, we are seeing a 23% growth. So not too bad. Of course, many people say, yeah, that's because of China. Sure. I mean, China is growing fast and it represents over 60% of the global market. So, of course, it's pushing the global market with it. But even if you take out China, if you look at the numbers, we have also a few surprises because one of the things that people say is that, oh, the US is going down. Well, not really. I mean, uh, Tesla, yes, it's not growing as fast, and basically in many places it's not growing, but there
And we're
are
gonna,
many.
we're going to do a segment on EV sales, and then we're going to tackle Tesla in all the markets, and then we're going to talk
Mhm.
Chinese EV tariffs. So those are the 3 topics for today, I should say. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So basically, while Tesla is not doing so well in the US, GM is having record sales, Hyundai is having record sales. So the others are compensating for the lack of growth coming from Tesla.
And
If
we
we go,
just as an example, we
mm,
just published today, Kia EV sales were up 112% in the US year over year last quarter. GM sales are also up a lot. A lot of brand sales are up. But the Tesla is such a huge part of the US market that when it's down, it pulls everything down with it, sort of. But then you look at all these other brands and they're like 112% EV growth from Kia is mass. I mean, that's a big deal.
it is. And actually, the US is doing that without the help of Chinese makers. So, in that is also an achievement. And yeah, looking at Europe, yes, sales were down a little bit significant because it's, for example, in May it was down 11%, but that has a logic behind it. I mean, the subsidies were removed in a number of countries, and especially in Germany, which is the major market in Europe. So it's natural that throughout 2024, sales aren't great.
Yeah, take a moment to highlight what happened in Germany because I think this
Mhm.
is the big story that's maybe often missed in the conversation.
So what happened in Germany prior to August 23? So they had very generous subsidies not only for private persons but also for company cars. So the EV market was growing fast, both on the private part of private buyers, but also on company cars. But then the German government, around August or September, removed the EV subsidies for company cars. So that side of the market started to go down, but we still had the private buyers buying EVs, so it was compensating more or less for that drop. But then, out of the blue, in the 15th of December, the German government took the subsidies for private persons also from the table. So
just suddenly, without expectation, and immediately, right?
yeah, so there was no time for a peak like sometimes you see. For example, it happened in the Netherlands where they announced with several months that they would remove the subsidy, so everybody in the last month was making like a year deliveries, a year volume of deliveries is in just 1 month.
Sometimes it's like the history of the Dutch EV market. It's like it's the most.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, in recent years it hasn't been, but for a long time it was like the boom bust market for that. But yeah, I also wondered like how much are German people like thinking, okay, well these should come back because of how it was done and everything, and like I just wonder how many buyers are like, of course everyone was surprised by it, but then they're like, okay, well, I'll wait to buy an EV for when this comes back. Do you think that's part of what's happening in Germany?
Could be. There is talk in the German media, or at least people are asking for the subsidies to return.
Yeah, I mean the way it was done, like immediate response was like, this is messed up. Like you like so there was never like a consensus, okay, this is happening. I feel like there was kind of immediate like, hey, we need to fix this. This shouldn't be like this. So I don't know, but it's such a big portion. I don't know if you know what percentage of the European EV market is German, or even auto market is the German market, but I know it's the largest, but I don't know what percentage it would be, but it is
Uh,
it's the largest.
20, 30%. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I don't know. But
Okay.
maybe around those numbers.
So it's significant. So it's like
Yeah.
it's a case of like, that's gonna hit. The other thing with Europe, to me, the way I understood it and sort of saw it is you had the regulations coming into effect a few years ago. Was it 2020 or 2021? 2020, where all of a sudden automakers were going to have to sell EVs or to pay big fines. And they knew that was coming for years. And so I feel like there was a kind of foot dragging that happened for a long time leading up to that. And then as soon as that hit, like they had to sell EVs, they had options, they pushed the models, they advertised them, and they produced enough to sell big volume. So then you had this huge spike in sales, huge growth. I don't know, it was 50% or even more. I don't remember. And then that sort of, kept going. Like there was kind of word of mouth and like multiplier effect with that, where the sales kept rising then after that. But then they sort of, my feeling is they sort of hit like a kind of like, okay, they've got that burst, but now it's naturally going to slow down a little bit because it's sort of like historically the Dutch market, like the boom bust.
Mhm.
And then my understanding also is that, is it next year or the year after, that the regulations again get stronger, and so automakers are again going to have to sell more,
Yeah.
and you might have faster growth again then as a result. Anything wrong there in my understanding of the history, or you want to elaborate on that? Or
Yeah, I think you are correct. And actually, it's no coincidence that all of a sudden, all those small EVs from European OEMs are starting in the second half of this year or starting on the early next year, because 2025, another set of rules are coming in and they will have to sell a lot more EVs. So this is not a coincidence. And on
there's a
subsidies,
kind of delay, there's kind of a holding back that's happening,
yeah,
and then you're going to get a burst of like better new models. So it's like you have to expect that the market is not going to be as strong, the growth or whatever, I mean whatever, is not going to be as strong.
yeah, I agree. And actually, That's why I wrote in some of my articles that the first half of 24 is a sort of no man's land because subsidies have ended, namely in Germany in 23, and then the new cheaper EVs are set to land in volumes in the second half of the year. So the first half, it's not unexpected that sales are down because it's in a valley between the end of subsidies and new cheaper EVs. But regarding subsidies,
Yeah.
I just wanted to add
Mhm.
that again the Dutch model at the moment, I think it's the most interesting because they have been limiting the subsidies to a price cap. So if in the beginning everybody had right to car subsidies like a Tesla Model S, now the subsidies are shrinking into a price level where it's like for affordable EVs.
Mhm.
And that helps a lot because that's the critical mass where we are lacking support. I mean, if you're buying, uh, let's say, a Tesla Model Y all-wheel drive, I mean, it's not 3 or 4 thousand that will make a big difference.
Mhm.
But if you're buying a Dacia Spring or a Citroën E3, 3 or 4 thousand euros will make a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the level of the market that needs support, not the medium to higher level.
That's a really good point, really interesting point. And yeah, I don't know what the situation is in Europe, but I've done these reports for the US where you look at what share of an automaker's auto sales are electric. And like the top five brands are all like premium brands. It's all like, Cadillac, Audi, Mercedes, Porsche. Like these are the brands that are selling, have the highest portion of their sales being electric now. And it's like you see them everywhere. You see advertising for them everywhere. I assume it's similar in Europe, where it's still
Yeah.
the higher end brands and models that have a higher portion of their sales being electric.
Yeah. I mean, for example, just looking at the best selling brands in Europe on the plug-in market, number one is Tesla, number two is BMW, number three is Mercedes, number four is Volvo, number five is Audi. Do you see a trend
That's,
there?
and that's not even about share of their sales, right? That's
Oh,
just overall sales.
all
So,
sales of,
so if you look at like share of their sales that are electric, it must be like far higher. Because in the
yeah.
US, you can have Ford and Chevrolet can be up there in the top sales, but their portion of sales is much lower because they sell a lot more vehicles in
Mhm.
general. So they must have really high. Like I'm very curious now to know what their internal, market share is in Europe, these brands. I don't know if that data is anywhere. I'm not going to ask. Yeah, we'll have to look into that more later on. I'm curious what their share is. But so that's the US, and we'll get more into there's yeah, the US market is interesting. I guess we'll get more into Tesla, but just on the US market, otherwise, yeah, it's a weird market. But we'll pause on that. We might come back to it. But it's
Mhm.
just there's a different culture, different market. We don't yeah, we technically we drive about twice as many miles or at least 50% more miles per year than Europeans. So there's just a lot of driving, a lot of big roads and big parking spaces and big cars. And like small cars that are popular in Europe would never sell in the US. So it's a strange market, but it's just so heavily influenced by Tesla that's really about the Tesla story more. But there are outside of Tesla, you have Chevrolet and Ford and some others like bringing more and more um, models to market that are going to be high sellers. So it's going to be keep growing. I think we're going to keep seeing strong growth from the other brands, Kia, Hyundai. Volvo is an interesting one because it had a high share of its sales electric, and it was supposed to bring the EX30, and now it's not going to. That's delayed a year. And I'm curious if you how much you can talk about that being related because this is a very popular model now in China and in Europe. And I'm just curious how much you think that's related to the Chinese tariffs or something else, or how or because they're moving, they're going to produce it in Europe instead of the US now, and it's delayed in the US. Can you say anything more about that model?
Yeah, sure. Again, we are talking about tariffs because when the current
And we're
administration,
not even on that topic yet. We will get to it more fully, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, tariffs are, let's say, the theme of the day right now. When the US administration increased the tariffs for Chinese EVs to 100%, basically it was a no-go for made in China EX30s. So, because they already had also that expectation that they would have problems in Europe because of tariffs, uh, they had decided for the European markets to start making it in Ghent, in Belgium. So now that they are going to make the EX30 in Ghent, Belgium, somewhere early next year, then they will just send those Belgian-made EX30s also to the US to circumvent the tariffs.
But then there's a delay with them, and they will cost more, I think, than if they're produced in the US. And it's just another case of like the US is the smallest and least important EV market of those big three. So it's like if it has to, it gets squeezed. So it's like we're going to get penalized because of changes that, Volvo has to prioritize Europe because it's a much bigger market and much more important market for it. Uh, but it's going to hurt the US a bit. But yeah, we'll come back to tariffs. So before we do that, I think let's jump into what's happening in China itself. So what's up with the Chinese EV market, which is, I mean, it's a phenomenal story. It's really
And the 1,000 models that they
yeah.
sell there.
Do you have the number? How many models? I mean, you must have the number, right? Is it
We
1,000?
have the number, but it's not 1,000, but it's getting there. It's like several hundreds of models.
Jeez, that's crazy. That's crazy. We have like a couple dozen in the US.
Yeah, and then you have, for example, just one OEM might have like 4 or 5 different brands just of EVs.
Yeah, yeah, just EV brands, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there must be a couple dozen EV only brands.
yeah. For example, let's talk about BYD. BYD has the namesake brand, has Denza, Fangcheng Bao, and Yangwang. 4 brands just from one OEM.
Yeah, and then you've got Geely's got Zeekr,
Link and Co.
Co. Yeah,
Radar, which is the pickup truck brand.
and what portion of Geely's brand sales are electric now? Is it around the same as the national average, or
I would say it's above national average. I don't have the
okay?
exact number, but it's above the national average. Because, for example, Zeekr is 100% BEV.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean just the yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, so yeah, yeah, right. So yeah. Um, so there's a couple things I want to go into in Chinese market. I guess we'll start with BYD. I mean, BYD is just the dominant player. Like I don't know, they're often like 8 out of 10 top 10 sales or BYD models or they have so many. How do they place within the broader auto market in China and like how is that changing because of this transition?
It's an interesting story because back in the day when we were talking about the ICE-based Chinese market, Volkswagen, Toyota, and Honda were big players. Like Volkswagen had, I would say, between 10 to 20% of the Chinese market. And now that the transitioning into EVs is happening fast, BYD is number one ahead of Volkswagen, Toyota. Geely has surpassed Honda, so Honda is now number 5. And the difference between, in May, for example, the difference between BYD and Volkswagen is staggering. BYD sold 248,000 units. Volkswagen sold 151,000. So BYD
Wow.
is almost doubling Volkswagen.
Wow, I didn't even realize. I guess I'm sure I did, but so much data comes in and goes out, that BYD had already become number one. But when did it become number one, the number one automaker in
I
China?
think it was somewhere last year.
That's what I was assuming. So it's just crazy that it's already like double Volkswagen. And I mean, I did at the end of the last year charts comparing BYD growth and Tesla growth, and BYD was just growing so much faster. It's like, Tesla had strong, great growth, but you're like, wow, BYD is like a whole different level of growth. And I mean, it just produces like I'm very curious what the brand is like to normal Chinese people, like because it's just so popular, but it must stand out for its value for money. But is it also because of how many new exciting models it rolls out so often? Is it seen as like a kind of Tesla in China, or is it seen as more of like a Ford or a Chevrolet, like value for money, but constantly bringing new models to market kind of brand? Not that
That's
you
a
live in
good
China.
question. That's
Not
a
that,
good question, actually.
yeah,
I would think a little bit of both. Um, it's a OEM that they are used to for a couple of decades already, even before EVs were fashionable. But on the other hand, they were the first to have in China to have like interesting EVs and like
yeah,
sexy EVs, like fast EVs. They were the first. So that in that aspect, it's also a little bit like a Chinese Tesla
yeah.
because
I remember the Tang and Chin. I
yeah,
feel like those were those sort of the breakout models for that.
yeah,
And then I think Xpeng and Neo, they came after those models, right?
yeah,
Yeah, so like all these other Zeekr, all these other brands, which now we're like, wow, they have so many like they like to call them smart electric vehicles or smart new energy vehicles. They
uh-huh.
like to use the word smart, not just electric vehicles, but they have so many of these, but I didn't really realize, honestly, didn't realize that BYD started it with like the Tang and the Chin, but those were the
Yeah,
first ones, right? Well,
yeah.
those were
I
at least
remember.
quick.
Yeah, yeah. They might have not looked nice. Like I remember the first tank looked a little bit like a Lexus,
Yeah.
but they were fast.
I think
And
the Han was the first one that was like, whoa, what happened with BYD?
yes, yes, that was like BYD 2.0, where
Yeah.
all this madness and conquering the world started. Was the Han?
Yeah, I think it was Kanan, our colleague at Clean Technica, and well, he works at Fastnet now. But I think he highlighted it for me first. He was like, where he mentioned about BYD creating really high tech good EVs, and I was like, BYD? I was like, what? And then you're looking at the Han, and it's like, oh wow, this is for real. And they innovate probably a lot more than they get credit for with some of their stuff. Yeah, they're just so quick with it. But yeah, well, I think that sort of story, it really clicked with me recently, and I did an article about how some of these big legacy brands, Toyota, Volkswagen, Ford, GM, they had so much of their growth story and so much of their story for investors based on growing in China. And like, you don't focus on it when you're focused on the US market, but like when they're talking to like investors, it's like all about the growth in China. And I mean, I don't know, they are in big trouble. I mean, they, I don't see how they have any growth story now because it was relying on China. They don't compete in China anymore. It seems to me like they're just dropping like flies in how they can compete with this EV transition with all these Chinese automakers. You have anything else to say? I mean, you've talked about it already, but it
Yeah.
triggers me to just think like, wow, this is like ruining their kind of story for investors.
Yeah, that's interesting because I mentioned before the ranking, like BYD is number one, Volkswagen number two. But more interesting than that is the dynamics between all these brands because BYD has doubled the sales of Volkswagen, but at the same time is growing 18% year on year.
Mhm.
At the same time, Volkswagen is dropping 13% year on year. So it's half, but it's going to be even worse in the future.
Yeah. No, it's really like they just uh, well, let's just jump. I mean, they're just not competitive in the new EV market. And I mean, let's jump to Tesla now, the second big
Mhm.
topic, because there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of disagreement on this because there are a lot of Tesla fans who still see Tesla as the most innovative car company and that they're still leading the way. And maybe there's a kind of quiet period because of, it's been a long time since the Model Y came out. The Cybertruck is this interesting side story, and it's all about AI and robotics, whatever. But a lot of other people, and I'm going to say myself included, like I just feel like these Chinese automakers are innovating, are doing stuff much quicker. Like even if you talk about the Cybertruck and the steer-by-wire, the wiring harnesses, the the cut in wiring, like there's Tesla's still doing a lot of interesting, good stuff. 48-volt architecture, but they're like half a dozen announcements a month from Chinese brands that are doing innovative stuff, and you're like, wow, this is great. Like it just feels like a different world, a different market where they're creating new options and new features so quickly, and that even Tesla, to me, it feels like can't keep up. I'm curious to hear what your take is on that. I don't know
Yeah,
if
that reminds me of something that I wrote for the Global article. Have a look at
the
that.
one that the one that we're about to publish.
Yes.
Okay.
Because, for example, Zeekr 001, the big flagship model of Zeekr, is a 3-year-old model, but by Chinese standards is already a veteran model. So they refreshed the car. They added like 800-volt architecture, new batteries, etc., because it was getting a little bit long in the tooth. That's
Yeah,
how you say it, right?
it's a weird phrase,
And
but that is 100% correct.
okay.
It makes me think like, what does that even mean? But yeah, we know that. Yeah, it's exactly correct. Yeah.
Okay, so they decided to renovate the car, and with all these new additions, the car went to record sales again.
Uh-huh.
So 13,000 units in May. So they don't let the models getting old, and
Yeah.
that I think is the problem that Tesla has right now.
Yeah, and I was actually triggered that this was actually triggered actually by another report, separate report, which highlighted that Chinese automaker EV producers are rolling out new models or significant upgrades every 20 months versus the industry average of every 40 months. And
Yeah.
they didn't specifically mention Tesla, but I was like, well, I mean, you had the Model Y came out like several years ago. You've had the Model 3 upgrade, and maybe we can talk about that separately because it's not clear to me that that's seen as big enough change in China. Like I sort of feels like that wasn't seen as a significant enough upgrade. And there's some discussion that maybe Tesla is delaying the Juniper upgrade of the Model Y because of lackluster response to the Model 3 Highland in China. And so they feel like they need to do more to compete there. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but I've seen rumors of that. What's your take on yeah, that upgrade, the Model 3 upgrade, but also just like, do you think Tesla is comparable or what's your take on those two things? I mean, I
The
mean, it
biggest
used to be
defense.
that it innovated so much, it was supposed to innovate so much more quickly than legacy
Yeah.
automakers. And there's still some argument to like what they brought to the Cybertruck.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've said enough. Let me hear your take.
I remember in 2018, I did a test drive with the Model 3 and I wrote it on Clean Technica.
Yeah.
And driving the Model 3 at the time felt like driving the future. Even more than a Model S, because yeah, the Model S had all that features, but also the price was not very friendly.
Yeah.
but the Model 3 was like mid-size, not that expensive, and it felt like driving the future.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, yeah, 2022, I rented a Model Y in the US. And basically, it felt I was driving exactly the same car, but with more space.
Yeah.
But
No,
that was it.
it's very
So,
scary.
yeah, 4 years
Even hard to
later,
count. Yeah, it's even hard to count it as like a new model. I mean, it is. I mean, even Tesla reports the sales together.
yeah.
It's just sort of like a larger version of the Model 3. I mean, now there's some distinction, but yeah, I don't know. So you're saying that you're not feeling the innovation.
Yeah, so the what is an advantage of Tesla is that they were so far ahead. They were years ahead of the competition, but in the meantime, the competition caught up. So they are now as good as the competition in the same level. That's why they are still number one, number two. But if they don't innovate in the next couple of years, they will lose out not only for the Chinese EVs, but even the legacy OEMs. They are finally showing up with dedicated EVs.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And just well, the Chinese market is so important to the Tesla story as well. I mean, about half of their vehicles are produced in China.
Yeah.
Uh, or maybe it's not that percentage anymore. I'm not sure what the percentage is now, but a large portion are produced and sold in China. Do you feel like they're at risk of really losing demand in China this year and next year? Because it's always hard to read the Chinese market, but I
Mm-hmm.
feel a little bit like there wasn't much of a bump from the high end, and the market just changes so fast. The consumers are so always wanting the next big thing that I feel like one of Tesla's biggest risks is losing sales, losing share of sales and sales in China. I don't know. You have a much better view of that.
I think Tesla is still important in China, but I think one of the reasons why things aren't picking up as they expected is that the refresh of the Model 3 hasn't worked in China for whatever reason. While the Model 3 sales, for example, in Europe are recovering due to the refresh, while the Model Y is tanking, in China is the Model Y that it's holding sales, and the Model 3 is not, it's like worse than last year without the refresh. So that's why I understand why Tesla decided to hold out the Model Y Juniper, because if they would screw up the Model Y, then probably the Chinese market would be in big trouble for them. That's why let's keep the winning champion just a couple more,
Yeah.
like
The window
another
open.
year. Yeah.
We're going to keep the window open. They're still in a solid position, but we're not really sure about the future. And do you think the Model 3 Highland didn't, do you think it's just it wasn't enough, or do you think that people actually don't like, for example, the changes with the stocks, the gears, drive, park,
I think
neutral?
one of the reasons is that the refresh could have been, let's say, deeper. The stocks is also something that might uh, prevent some buyers to have it. Uh, Personally, I think the outside design hasn't improved. The inside, for me, the new Model 3, it's a level up over the previous generation,
Yeah.
but the outside design, it's not as good. And also, we have the case of competition.
Yeah. Well, so this is the bigger issue in China. And I still want to stick to like Tesla's issues other places, but how much do you think there's a problem in China of all of the price cuts and all of the new models sort of spoiling consumers a little bit, where they constantly expect price cuts and new models like every quarter? Like they're not like, is there kind of a problem of consumer expectations have gotten too high? and and is it like I sort of feel like there's a problem for like every like Neo, Xpeng, BYD even, where there's a kind of like if they don't roll out a new model or big price cuts, they face a demand problem like every few months or something because there's just
Could be.
always the expectation that something better is around the corner. Is that, do you think that's a big issue in the Chinese EV market, or you think I'm too reading too much into it, too concerned about it?
Yeah, I agree because they are changing models every 2 to 3 years. People are expecting to buy one car today, and then 4 years from there, they are buying a completely different car, like much improved range, much improved style, features, etc., etc. The problem with Tesla is that you bought a Tesla Model 3 in 2020, you compare it with the Model 3 in 24, okay, the refresh might help, but it's not that much of a difference.
Yeah. But even outside of Tesla, do you think there's a kind of bubble or a concern with the Chinese EV market where like you can't dramatically improve forever? Like they've been able to recently, but like the next 4 years, like are they going to be able to keep dramatically improving EVs? And if not, is there going to be a kind of bubble bursting or kind of slump, or do you think it's just kind of like it's not a big concern?
I would think about it in two levels. The first level is regarding innovation, and there's a lot of ways to innovate yet. I mean, you have sodium batteries, solid state batteries, and several OEMs are announcing their targets there. So there will be constantly new innovations, not only regarding batteries, but also autonomous drive, etc., etc.
Or
So
oh yeah, more automakers are partnering on battery swapping deals
yeah,
too,
yeah.
cattle and different and with Neo and others. With autonomous driving, well, do you have more to say before we get? I wanted to get
Ah,
into
yeah.
that.
The second one has to do with the number of brands. I mean, I agree. I mean, it's not
Right.
possible for them to continue at this level of brands. I mean, it's so many. So some degree of consolidation might happen in the future. But I wouldn't be surprised if Chinese could have, I would say, 20, 30 brands with world class level in the future.
And I guess in a comparison, so Norway just set, they were the trailblazers. I remember going to, was it 2013 maybe, or even earlier, 2012 maybe, EV conference in Barcelona, and like Norway had just hit like 13% of sales being electric. It's like huge deals, like holy cow. And then the question was always like, well, can that keep going? Can it really create that S curve, up to the top? Or, there's always a question of whether you're being too expecting too much. And Norway did. I mean, Norway got up to 90% EV share, basically following the S curve perfectly. So there's that history, but China's a much different, bigger market. Do you think it will also just keep following that S curve and market share will keep growing? Or do you think it could have more difficulty getting up to like 90%? Or do you think it's going to be, similar kind of trajectory?
Assuming everything goes as it is, like business as usual scenario, I think it could well be that scenario because
It just follows
what's
normal.
what's happening is that Chinese brands are electrifying fast their lineups, and on the other hand, foreign brands are losing market share every day. So basically, in the future, we might see a Chinese automotive market that will be 80 to 90% local, and then 10 to 20 for foreign brands.
No powerful Chinese people are going to shed a tear about that. There's no one to like save the
Yeah,
legacy foreign automakers. I mean, it's not like in the US or Germany where if automakers have a problem, they get saved. I mean, there's no one there, no one cares about them. That no one wants them to be saved, right? So it's like, so you could see that being the transition. Well, there's other broader macroeconomic questions regarding the economy in China. Have various opinions on that. So that's
mhm.
always play a factor, but that's outside of the scope, I think, of our discussion. But I have seen that brought up, that there might be issues just because of economic issues. But again, you got every opinion in the world on that, so who knows? Um, with autonomy, so this sort of feels like the next big innovation or feature set that is going to distinguish brands. And my understanding in China is certain cities have infrastructure where they have infrastructure put in to support autonomous driving systems in some cars, some car brands, where they will be able to have robotaxis in several major cities, or robotaxi capability in several major cities from major Chinese auto brands, not relying on some kind of general approach like Tesla's, and not relying on something like Waymo has created, but sort of it's kind of a partnership that's like the infrastructure and the automobile combined to create this capability. Do you see this as sort of being the dominant way forward for autonomous driving in China? Obviously, Tesla is like a big question mark. What will Tesla achieve? I don't want to get into that because that's like a never-ending debate. It's just
Yeah.
never ending until something happens. But but just looking at the China story, do you think that's going to be creating a lot of autonomy in the next few years in Chinese auto market?
Autonomy is a big question mark, and there has been a lot of debate about it. And I'm not really a specialist on it. I can tell you this. The big advantage that the Chinese OEMs have is diversity. Because there are so many of them, there's not really one way to solve an issue. They have many times opposing ways to address the same problem. So diversity breeds innovation. So probably that diversity will help them getting to the end game.
Yeah. And you think that will be like one of the new features that you have to have in an EV in like a couple of years to like be a popular EV?
I would say level 4 would be important.
Yeah, I
Level
mean,
5,
not necessarily talking about sending the cars out, but just like if I buy a car, I want it to be able to drive me to work and not have to interact, right?
yeah, yeah. So that would be a major help. But again, it will all depend on the brand or the OEM ability to assume all liability. And that, for me, is the big question. Will Tesla or any other OEM assume all liabilities of a crash or something that happens to that vehicle? Because it's not really autonomous until you assume all responsibility for what happens.
Yeah, it's a good point. And there's a lot of hype around how much safer Tesla full self-driving is than driving a Tesla or any other car without full self-driving. And it drives me a little nuts because I've had full self-driving for the past, several years. And for the most part, it has not been a great experience. And you just have to be hyper attentive. And the stats, like if you have a hyper attentive driver who put $6,000 to $15,000 into their car to buy this feature and probably owns stock in the company, so doesn't want it to look bad, they're going to be extra careful monitoring and using full self-driving. So I don't think it's a stat that you can really compare to normal driving because you don't have the same level of attentiveness. So in the period when it was not a good system, it just doesn't make any sense. Since version 12, it has become a really good system. Like it actually drives naturally and does a lot and seldom makes me intervene. So there's a big distinction between what they've achieved from version 12. But still, you just can't compare it. So I like what you're saying is like basically, if it's really safer, if it's really that much safer, then Tesla should take the liability, and then they can prove that it's that much safer because they're taking over the liability. And until
Yeah.
that happens, like anyone can say anything, but if you're not taking the liability, how much face do you have in your technology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're done with China. They're still like well, I guess I'm curious about a few brands. So what do you think of Xpeng, Neo, and Li Auto? And just we can even start with Li Auto because I thought Li Auto was a ridiculous brand when its first model was out. I was like, what is this giant vehicle? Like, there's this company is going nowhere, plug-in hybrid giant SUV like an Escalade or bigger. And I couldn't feel it. I couldn't see it. It's been a ridiculously popular and successful brand. And now I think they've got four, is it three or four?
One, two, three, L6, L7, L8, L9, and the Mega. Five models.
Five models. They're all gigantic.
Yeah.
And this brand is like the most successful like EV startup. What the heck, dude? Is it just there's people with money want that kind of giant, gaudy kind of vehicle, and there's a lot more people with money who want that than I realized before.
I think they tapped on a trend in the market when it's still in its first days, which is if you look at the Chinese top sellers, you have several models that are full-size models, like the Ito M7, which is a competitor to Li Auto. It's a full-size SUV. You have the Li Xiang 7, which is a full-size SUV. You have the Ito M9, which is Cadillac Escalade-like full-size SUV, competitor to Li Auto. You have the Denza D9, which is a gigantic minivan. All these in the top 20. So what they found was a niche, which is no longer a niche in the market, that there was not really that much supply. They picked it up, and then they found also another niche, which is range extended plug-in hybrids.
Yeah.
So based on those two
Are
trends
they
that no
all
one,
are they all range extended plug-in hybrids still, or do they have a full electric yet?
the Mega, the Cyber minivan, which is gigantic also, that's BEV. It charges at around 500 kilowatts, which is mind-blowing. But everything else is range extended. And they picked up on those two trends and made it mainstream. So now there's a lot of gigantic SUVs in the Chinese auto market, and now there's a lot of range extended models.
Yeah.
But it started with Li Auto, so they picked up on the right time,
Yeah.
at the right place, and now they are successful. For me, the question is, what's next?
Yeah. Are they
And
gonna
when,
down they're gonna offer some smaller one? I mean, yeah, how much space do they have for growth, right?
yeah, for me, the most surprising aspect of Li Auto is that they started to export to Russia
Yeah.
this year, and they are selling like over 2,000 units of those models every month in Russia.
I mean, it sort of sounds like the story of like, doesn't matter where you go in the world, a large portion of rich people are going to want to buy the biggest vehicles they can and rule the road.
Yeah.
And it sort of feels, I mean, I just constantly compare it to the Cadillac Escalade, which is a very popular vehicle in rich areas of the US. And it's also historically a popular vehicle to put in rap videos and movies. And, it's got this kind of like, oh, that's the pinnacle. Oh, you've achieved success. You have this large SUV.
Mhm.
And whereas the Cadillac Escalade has that, in the West, it sort of feels like that's the place Li Auto is occupying in China and maybe more and more markets in the future, where it's like, oh, your little Escalade. It's sort of like the Cybertruck, what the Cybertruck is trying to do as well. I mean,
Yeah.
similar kind of. I don't see the Cybertruck as competing with trucks as much as I see it competing with large SUVs. But
Mm.
But yeah, I'm curious to see how that's going to do in like China, for example. 'Cause you look, it's going to be like the Li Autos and the cyber
Mhm.
trucks, and I don't know, but it's an interesting story. And then what about Xpeng and Neo? Because to me, they seem like the fastest innovators often, and they have really cool, awesome new products. And you're like, wow, that looks like the coolest car. But they also seem to suffer from like they roll out a new vehicle, it does really well for a little while, and then it's not the hot new thing anymore, and they have to have another one, or someone else is coming up, like another brand or whatever. What's your take on that?
I agree with you. I think both are innovative brands, but they suffer a little bit from that. What's new? What's new? I want something else, And particularly on Xpeng, they suffer from that because their EVs are quite good.
Yeah. It blows my mind they don't sell like 10 times
Yeah,
because I'm like, this is an amazing vehicle for an amazing price.
yeah, I agree. The G9, the big SUV, I was like, what? They only sell for 60,000 euros? A
Yeah.
nice SUV like this, like that's like an Audi Q8 e-tron, big fat SUV, all luxuries, and just 60,000 euros. I'm like, whoa. But Neo has one advantage over Xpeng, which is the swappable technology,
Yeah.
swappable
Yeah.
battery technology.
And that seems to have done really well. Like
Yeah,
that is a big reason why people buy Neos, right?
yeah. If you get into that ecosystem, then you don't want to change for a different brand. So that's a good competitive edge that Neo has over the competition. The question is, will they get enough clients to their ecosystem to make them profitable for decades?
But I have seen news that them partnering, was it with Volkswagen and I think a big Chinese brand as well, or it seems like more other automakers are going to start working with Neo to also offer battery swapping. Sounds like so. It's like it looks really like it's going to just continue growing. But well, okay, we're done with China. Except
Just let me talk about
okay,
one brand.
yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely.
It's called Xiaomi. I don't know if you know the Xiaomi
Yeah,
cell
yeah,
phone
yeah,
company.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So Xiaomi is a cell phone company that's quite successful. And when they announced that they were going to launch an EV, I thought like, okay, they're copying Apple again. So I was a little bit skeptic of what their EV would look like. And then they launched the car. It was awesome. It's like Model S kind of car for less than Model 3 price, looking like somewhere between a Porsche Taycan and a Jaguar. So I thought, whoa. And apparently, a lot of people also thought about it and thought, whoa, because they had like 100,000 reservations for the car. And
It's a lot.
another thing that's blowing my mind is that they announced they will sell 100,000 units of that model this year.
Yeah. So it's like we've talked about these other EV brands, which similar kind of offerings, but then not the quite that scale right off the bat. And I mean, definitely not. And is it also a case of like this company can sort of subsidize this push and jack up to mass market quicker because of its other business? Is that what's going on partly?
Yeah, actually, it's a little bit like the story of BYD. BYD started as a battery company.
Right.
So they already had the batteries, they just needed to know how to work out the cars.
Mhm. So it's like
And
what people expected from Apple and Sony and Samsung. I mean,
yeah,
because we've seen this like expectation from all of these companies for the past decade, but none of them have really come up with like they've none of them have really delivered on what you expected would be possible. But it sounds like this is the first one that is, yeah.
yeah, exactly. So um, they've launched the car like 2 months ago, April or around that. And from April till December, they expect to make 100,000 units. And this is a brand new uh, car company. okay, it's part of the big cell phone company, but it's their first year taking care of production, deliveries, etc. of an EV. If
And
they manage to do that, it's amazing.
where does the phone company stand in the market? Like, is it a premium? Uh, or
Value
like
for money, I would say.
value for money? That's what I thought, but then I, I'm sort of surprised that translates into a lot of car sales too. But because you could see, I can imagine like an Apple buyer being like 100% I'm going to buy an Apple car, but like a lower cost phone, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh yeah, I want a car that's the same as my phone. But maybe that is really just the case. Like once you're a customer of that brand, you're like, yeah, I want a car from that brand too.
Yeah, actually, Xiaomi, I said it was a cell phone maker because it's what it's known most outside of China. But
Yeah,
from what I've read, it's a appliance company. Like they produce a bunch of stuff in China.
interesting.
So
So it's more like,
producing just another thing, an EV, for many people, is just like they have already their cell phone Xiaomi, they have their TV Xiaomi, so they have all their appliances Xiaomi. So they
yeah,
also have their car. And one of the interesting features of Xiaomi that they presented in the beginning was that everything can be connected.
yeah.
So part of the ecosystem again.
I mean, and again, it's just an example, so much more innovation and new options in China than elsewhere, it seems like. So yeah, I want to get to the China tariffs, and China exports because I feel like there's a lot of these companies, as much as it's grown in China, to continue their growth and to like reach profitability and stuff, they need to start finding more export markets. I think that's obvious. But just to finish with Tesla, like we talked about China, the US story to me, they've dominated the market. They've been over 50% of the market for the past however long. They were at like 80% and like 70 and then 60. Now they're barely above 50%, and actually quarter two might be the first time they drop below 50%. So they've been sort of sliding down as more options come to the market. There's also been research that like a lot of Democrats used to want to buy a Tesla and now don't because of Elon Musk saying all kinds of crazy stuff on X, and just sort of going in a whole different direction with his public persona. But so there's a demand issue there. I think they're facing in the U.S. from him getting into politics, and I. But there's also the broader issue of other automakers bringing EVs to market seriously finally. So I think that's the story in the U.S. We don't really need to dive into that. I'm very curious. Tesla's done exceptionally well in Europe, despite the kind of barriers of domestic auto brands, dominating sales in their countries, whether that's Peugeot and Renault in France or BMW and Volkswagen and Mercedes in Germany, or elsewhere others. But so it's always been surprising like that how much Tesla actually broke through and became a major brand in the European auto market. It's still mind-blowing like the Model Y can be such a top-selling vehicle everywhere. But you've always talked about, I mean, or at least for the past couple of years, you've brought up natural limits, which some people don't believe in. And other people are like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. What's your take on the natural limits of Tesla in Europe and how you see the brand doing in the next year or two in Europe?
Mhm. We have
And
to look
I know
at.
you're not a forecast. I know you don't, you're cautious. You're not a forecaster. You're documenting what's happening, but you have the best insight into what's happening.
Mhm.
So I think you have to have one of the best minds for forecasting as well.
Okay. So we have to look into context and to see how much has Tesla achieved, because we are also looking at every month and we lose the big picture.
Yeah.
Tesla was the first company to have a BEV as number one in the whole world in 2023. that's a major milestone, not only for Tesla, but for the EV world in general.
Yeah, it's still mind-blowing. The Model Y was the best-selling model in the world.
Yeah.
Crazy. I mean, even the most optimistic of us wouldn't necessarily say that would have happened by 2023.
Yeah. So if you're already number one, I mean, how high, how much more can you grow, right?
Number zero.
You have that issue. And in Europe, it's also a historic moment because not only it was the first BEV to be number one in the global European market, but I think it was the first non-European model to be number one in Europe, which is mind-blowing. So that alone will place the Model Y in history. But again, it's hard to go up to number one, but it's even harder to stay in number one, right?
Right.
So
In
the
everything.
competition,
Not just talking about cars, it's sort of the story in everything. Like once
yeah,
it's hard to get to number one, it's harder to stay at number one,
yeah.
right?
Because if you're going to number one, you have your own set of skills and the competitive advantages over the competition. But once you get to number one, your competitive skills are being copied and taking advantage of everyone else. So everyone else is also doing the same game. So you have to innovate in order to keep staying in number one, to be ahead of the competition. And the problem with Tesla is that, as we mentioned before, the rate of innovation is not as much as it was in the beginning.
And maybe let's put a disclaimer because Tesla fans and Elon Musk, they will say the rate of innovation is still, they're still leading. It's just it's in autonomous driving, AI, and robots, and that this is what's going to matter in the next few years. I'm not I just want to put that because that's sort of their argument. That's the argument. And I think there's a big debate about whether that's really the case or not. And when we say innovation, I'm talking about like new models, new features in models, all kinds of other innovations beyond that. And I guess also, so the other claim is, they have the most efficient, most innovative manufacturing. That's a highly debatable, I think, topic as well that we're not going to touch here. But so keep going with your. I just wanted to put that out there because I know, like immediately, I'm thinking, oh, this is what a lot of people are going to say. But
Thank you for that, because that's also important to say. Another thing that's important to look at is the structure of the European market. The best-selling cars have been historically Volkswagen Golf, Peugeot 208, Renault Clio. They are all compact to small cars, relatively cheap. The Model Y is a mid-size SUV, so it was the first time that such a big car, such an expensive car, came to number one. So that is not the rule, that is the exception. So once new, cheaper EVs come into the market, they will have a bigger pool to play in than the Model Y. Basically, the Model Y came to number one because it dominated the medium-sized market in Europe.
and
The
sort
others
of
don't need to get there.
I was sort of pooling buyers from a lot of different
Yeah,
classes, a lot of different segments of the market because of the limited options. And once
yeah,
there's more options in those other segments, you would think it would lose those customers that are not naturally in that segment, right?
yeah. So the natural bestseller in Europe in the future will be a compact model or a small EV. It won't be a mid-size SUV that starts at 45,000 euros.
Yeah, and we won't even, I think let's not even talk about whether that comes from Tesla or not, because it's been very confusing to try to figure out what Tesla's doing in that segment because news stories have been here and there on yeah what Tesla's looking to roll out in the future. But I think we can wrap up with Tesla then. And so what's your take on Chinese EV tariffs? What's the
The,
story? I guess we should introduce it in case anyone isn't aware. And
yeah,
yeah,
this is very much on topic. Is the conversations that are happening is all around EV tariffs in Europe. And so let's go back a little bit. Chinese EVs already paid 10% tariff when coming into Europe, just like every Chinese or made in China model coming into Europe. Considering the profit margins they have in China, people thought, well, 10% is not a lot because the profit margin is like 3 times that. So not only the Chinese OEMs made in China, but BMW starting making the iX3 in China and sending out to Europe. Renault started making the Dacia Spring in China and sending out to Europe, etc., etc.
Tesla makes the Model
Because
3.
the Model 3 with Tesla starting sending out from China to Europe because the margin is so significant that just 10% makes it still very profitable. So that happened, and the share of made in China models in Europe started to increase significantly. The Dacia Springs and Model 3, and now the Volvo EX30 started to show up in the first spots of the EV market. And I guess that might have scared a few minds. So people started thinking, wait a minute, if they are getting this profit margin and selling at this price, something is going on. So that's why they placed an investigation. Apparently, with these results, something was proven that there were some subsidies given. So they took these temporary tariffs. But this is interesting. It's just to BEVs. If like MG wants to sell a petrol MG ZS, it's still the 10%.
I didn't even think about that. That was so, and they're also being produced in China
And they
somehow.
are also being produced in China. Same story for plug-in hybrids. So
Only BEVs, not even plug-in hybrid. I wasn't even thinking about that either. So plug-in hybrids are gonna get a boost in market share. Yeah.
so imagine this. You have the BYD song. They have a BEV version and a plug-in hybrid version. The BEV version will be hit with an extra 18% tariff. So they will cost, I would say, 8,000 euros more. But the same model, but with a plug-in hybrid version, just because of tariffs, will be 6 to 8,000 euros cheaper.
I wonder which model is going to sell more in Europe.
Yeah, that will be there. There are a couple of questions that I'm wondering. So the average tariff increase will be from 10% to 30%. So it will be interesting to see if Chinese OEMs just absorb this increase in tariffs into their profit margin. So instead of earning 30%, they just earn 10%. That's a possibility. Another possibility is to increase the price like halfway, and they get hit a little bit on the profitability, and they pass part of the increase into consumers, or if they just keep the profit margin and the car increases 6,000 euros, etc.
Yeah.
Another side effect of this is, coincidence or not, a lot of plug-in hybrids will surely start to appear in the European market coming from Chinese brands.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems inevitable. Yeah. Plug-in hybrid share is going to increase. Like, seems like. Yeah. So is that the full thing on the European story for you, or is there something more to add on that, or? I know there's still negotiations
Mhm.
happening about it, but I don't know if you have any insight. I don't have any insight into what's expected, if it's expected that they get watered down or changed or anything.
I think if it just ends in the 20% average increase on the OEM prices, keeping plug-in hybrids out of this equation, for example, yes, it will set back the electrification targets in Europe for an extra 2 or 3 years, but it won't be the end of the world. If they start to hit plug-in hybrids, or if they start to increase to US levels of tariffs because of a possible trade war, then things get complicated, and the 2035 ICE ban in Europe gets complicated to get there.
Yeah.
So let's hope there's not an escalation and it just keeps at, let's say, level one of trade tariffs and not
Yeah.
100%.
I think that was sort of a positive sign because the US story is a little less nuanced. It's sort of like China bad, 100% tariff. And
Yeah.
this is what it seems to have happened in the US. It's like there's this kind of it's very big politically to be like China bad, China bad. And also, I think just a struggle in the country to bring manufacturing back to the country that's been lost over the past several decades, or a few decades at least. Um, so there's a kind of, but they just like slapped 100% tariffs on them, and it's like this is wild. So it's not really clear what's going to happen in the U.S., but obviously more EVs will be produced there to be sold there than might have been previously, for sure. Whether that keeps out Chinese brands as well, that's unclear. That's always been a question mark. What's going to happen with like it's always been a question about BYD, Zeekr, Neo, Xpeng coming to the US as well, but it's just not a priority market anyway. So I don't know, but it seems like the European situation much more nuanced, much more calculated, and it seems unlikely to really change what's going to happen there. But laying out all the possibilities you brought up. What's your thought though on the idea that they're overly subsidized, that Chinese automakers get too much subsidy and are dumping product elsewhere as they need to?
I would think like state-owned OEMs probably
Kind
have
of
some,
say BAIC and CAIC, right?
yeah, those kind of, I think Shangan also. So the state-owned OEMs probably have some sort of preferential treatment, but I would imagine Geely or BYD having the same access to everything else. Like even Tesla
It's
had
just
some subsidies. It's like open to the market, you
yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, do you think it's much different from what's available in Germany, in the US? And because I mean, that's sort of the counter argument is like all of these countries have subsidies and incentives for this stuff. Is it really different what's happening in China, or is it just a more competitive market where they brought costs down more?
That's a good point. I'm not 100% sure on that. But what I can say is that people in China, instead of subsidizing old businesses, like it has been the case in Europe and in the US, where like 100-year-old companies are getting subsidies to keep factories open, etc., etc. In China, they had the vision to see, hey, we're not going anywhere with ICE, so let's subsidize and spend that money instead of old factories. Let's subsidize investigation and electrification.
Yeah, and just vision and putting and making a plan, it seems like. Yeah. Well, yeah, fascinating discussion. This was probably I probably took too much of your time. This is a this is a long discussion. I hope to have do more of these with you, but don't expect them to be this long so that, I don't want to scare you away and not have you like,
Okay.
can't do it because we expect it to be so long. We haven't connected for a long time. So, I mean, like, video wise. So thanks a lot. I think really fascinating discussion, and I think a lot of people will enjoy the yeah, getting your insight into it. Everybody loves your monthly report, so
Thanks.
yeah, I'm sure they'll appreciate seeing this. So, all right, thanks a lot, Jose, and
Okay, thank you.
guess good luck to Portugal in the Euro tournament, Euro 2024 tournament.
We need it.
I'm pulling for Holland. That's always been my favorite team.
Okay.
They need it more, I would say, and and Spain I like a lot as well, but Portugal's a fun, exciting team and a lot of promise as well. So it's getting to an exciting stage of the tournament.
Yeah.
So all right, thanks a lot.
Okay,
Cheers.
bye-bye. Cheers.
Hi, my name is Scott Cooney. I started Clean Technica to promote clean energy and other sustainable alternatives, and for 13 years we've been moving markets. If we had a nickel for every time someone told us they bought their first EV, solar, e-bike, or fill in the blank clean energy solution, we'd be a cable TV channel by now. But we don't get those nickels. So unfortunately, we could use your help to reach a few more people. If just 1% of our audience chipped in a few bucks a month, we could hire dozens of great journalists and promote all sorts of climate solutions. It's easy. Just go to cleantechnica.com/support and sign up with a credit card in seconds. Cancel anytime. But we'll be sending out some cool perks too, so I think you'll want to stick around. With your support, we'll keep leading the charge. Thank you so much.